Have you ever considered what is the worst mistake ever made by science? Well, according to today's guest, Dr. Ferric Fang, professor in the departments of laboratory, medicine and pathology, microbiology, medicine, and global health at the University of Washington School of Medicine, and Dr. Arturo Casadevall, Bloomberg Distinguished Professor in the Johns Hopkins School of Public Health and Medicine, and co-authors of the book Thinking About Science. The scientific process has the power to deliver a better world and may be the most monumental human achievement ever made. But when it is unethically performed or miscommunicated, science can also be devastating. I'm Ashley Hagen, host of Meet the Microbiologist, the American Society for Microbiology's podcast about the people who discover, innovate, and advance the field of microbiology. A few months ago, I had the pleasure of speaking with Arturo and Ferric on our show, where we discussed good science, bad science, and how to make it better. You can find that episode on asm.org or on a podcast listening app. So I could have spent all day talking to these two, and I jumped at the chance to continue the conversation. So welcome back, Ferric and Arturo.
Thank you, Ashley.
Thanks, Ashley.
It's great to see you again. To get us started, would you please just give us a little bit of background info about how the two of you met?
I sent him an email when he was the editor-in-chief of Infection and Immunity. Actually, we met long before that in scientific conferences. But what really got this collaboration going was back almost 20 years ago. He was the editor-in-chief of Infection and Immunity, and I was an editor. And I was getting totally fed up with the fact that people were dissing manuscripts by calling them descriptive. And I couldn't believe this. I mean, why don't we throw out all of astronomy? It's all descriptive. Why don't we throw out all of paleontology? And I wrote to him and I said, this is unacceptable. So we began a long collaboration of essays. And the first one was descriptive science.
Yeah, what I remember is when I had the privilege of taking over from Alison O'Brien to become the editor-in-chief at I&I, that I met with all my editors, and I said, I'd like to take advantage of this position to come up with commentaries about aspects of science, not necessarily the nuts and bolts of our specific specialties, but rather global issues that affect all scientists, and particularly scientists in training. And I would welcome any of you who had ideas that you wanted to collaborate on this. And Arturo was the one who jumped up and he said, I have 5 ideas. And he started writing me emails, and I would respond to his emails, and we would go back and forth 5 or 6 times, and we would say, hey, we could publish this just as it is, because we had different perspectives. But an amazing thing about working with Arturo is that although he's brilliant and he has so many ideas, he's incredibly generous as a collaborator. And he never gets wedded to his point of view. He always wants to see what somebody else thinks about it. He'll commonly send me something which could just be published as is and say, take out whatever you don't like, put in whatever you want. And so I've never had an easier collaborator to work with that's more of a
That's
pleasure.
because I know that Ferric is always right. Seriously, he's always right. So when he trashes the idea, you know what? The idea was gone.
Have you been talking to my wife again?
Actually, I don't know your wife.
So it sounds like an amazing story that's turned into a partnership and a friendship, and also was the impetus for this book. So let's dive in and start with the question that I posed to the audience in the beginning. What is the worst mistake ever made by science?
Start with that. So this is actually a very tough question, because as scientists, we think about all the wonderful things that science has done and that we hope it will do. But to an objective observer, science has also been responsible for a lot of things that have had disastrous consequences for the world and for our society. And so there's a long list. You can think of all these pollutants. You can think of climate change being generated by technologies that were made possible by science. You can think about all kinds of weaponry and all the lives that have been lost because of advances in weapons technology. But we came across an article by an anthropologist in Australia named Darren Curnow, where he made a very persuasive argument that the worst thing science has ever done is to divide the humanity into races and to create the idea that there was actually a biological basis for racial distinctions, which now has been thoroughly discredited by modern genetics. But the idea has become toxic and it's lived on, and it's a social construct that's real, that we now know that the genetic differences amongst individuals are much greater than the genetic differences across different groups. And we now know that if you look in an agnostic way at the genetics of humanity, that it's a continuum, that there aren't these discrete groups which are really genetically definable. But so much of medicine and biology and sociology has been defined by these artificial categories, which ironically were generated in a kind of benign, well-meaning way, that people traveled the world. Johann Friedrich Blumenbach was a famous German polymath who traveled widely, and he was fascinated by the diversity in people that he saw, in their appearance, in their languages, in their customs, culture. And so he created this group of 5 racial groups, which are really close to the way people think about race today. And lots of extrapolations were made out of this, which have been extremely damaging. And so Arturo and I came to agree with Dr. Curnow that that is the worst thing that's happened, and now there's a special responsibility for scientists to educate people that this is not a biologically based concept, and that a lot of harm is done in the name of race, and a lot that has to be undone, that I think science has a lot of responsibility for.
So science fueled racism, but science also gives you the answer that there are no biological differences. So in a way, it's self-correcting.
That was going to be my next question. What do we do sort of to prevent these mistakes from happening in the future? And also, how do we manage the mistakes that have happened in the past?
Well, I think that we're a lot more cognizant today that almost anything that you do has potential dual use. And I think that all our work, we're much more aware of it. And that, to me, is the single most important thing, because in the past, people weren't necessarily aware that what they were doing could fuel misconceptions that would have terrible consequences in society.
I think there's the old cliche that science is self-correcting, which is a good thing about science. But what we've learned in looking at problematic publications, things that have erroneous or fraudulent findings in them, is that science itself as a process is not self-correcting. That things that are put into the body of what we consider scientific knowledge that are wrong, or perhaps even falsified or fabricated, only get rooted out if scientists come in and identify them and take actions to correct them. And this is hard to do. You know, you have to deal with journals and institutions, and there's lots of obstacles to correcting the body of scientific knowledge. So what I would say is science is correctable, but it's corrected by the direct, concerted, sustained efforts of scientists to correct it. And if we don't do that, it remains uncorrected. There's lots of things everybody can tell you in their field that are wrong, that are in the literature, and need to be corrected. So we can't look at the body of the literature or what's currently understood as being something that is etched in stone. It's something that we have to constantly remodel and make better. There's a quote attributed, I think, to Osler that was repeated at my medical school graduation that kind of stuck with me, that I think is not just true for physicians, but it's true for PhD scientists, that he said, half of everything we've taught you is wrong. The problem is we don't know which half. And so when you approach your career, you can take certain things as a given, and some are fairly well established, but even well-established things need testing, challenging, reinforcing, and you find sometimes things that we all know turn out not to be right. And it's delightful to me when that happens, because we're moving forward and closer to really understanding what the truth is.
So this is kind of a good segue. What makes scientific discovery so important?
science is humanity's greatest insurance policy, period. And what all of you are doing here, and all the practitioners of science, are generating information. Our species is unique in that it can learn from each other, and so you may say, well, what I'm working in may not necessarily change the world. I would say you don't know that. Somebody stops in a hot spring in Yellowstone in 1972, and it revolutionizes criminology. Think about the connections of science. So I think that working in science, working to support science, being part of the largest scientific establishment is the most important thing that anybody could be doing today, because humanity is facing some of its greatest crises going forward. And the solutions are scientific. You can pass as many laws as you want, get the carbon out of the atmosphere. It won't get out. But science may be able to provide ways by which we survive.
Arturo came up with a set of criteria to define whether the science you're doing is important, because he found when he went to the literature, there was no real definition of important. A lot of times, you'll get a review back on a paper that says this is not important, but there are no universal criteria for that. And so Arturo came up with criteria, which I
didn't
love.
come up. It was emails back and forth.
But I take credit. I take credit for the acronym. So we can spell the word spin with these 4 characteristics, and you need to have at least one of the first 3, and then you need to have the 4th. So the S stands for size, which means it has to deal with a problem that is really large. We compared the idea of working on Mycobacterium tuberculosis, which affects over 1 billion people, with Mycobacterium microti, which is just as interesting, but it only affects rodents in a very small localized population. And so the bigger issue is really Mycobacterium tuberculosis in people. The P stands for practical, and so that is pretty obvious. If you do something that people can use and make it into a drug or make it into a product and improve people's lives, then it's important. The I is actually my favorite, and it stands for integrated, and it's the idea that some findings are integrated with a lot of other knowledge that we have, and so they make things clear, they explain things. The kind of finding that says, this explains everything. It can integrate with diverse observations, tie them together mechanistically, so it's deeply rooted in the tree of knowledge. If you have one of those 3, and then that it's new, and so obviously if it's not new, then it's already discovered, then it's important. And it reminds me of something that Frank Harrell, the great bacteriologist, had written. He had passed on, a lot of people know this in some form. He said let me see if I can get this right. There's 3 phases in the
discovery
life of any scientific discovery. The first one is, it's not true. And the second one is, well, it's true, but it's not important. And the third one is, well, it's true and it's important, but it's not new.
New. So it doesn't matter where you are, you're going to run into one of those. The important thing is to just keep going.
Very good. So here's a shift, a little bit of a shift. How do you think research funding should be allocated?
Ha. Well, I'm a big proponent of a modified lottery. And what do I mean by a modified lottery? I mean, scientists are very good at discriminating between good and bad science. Everybody, you can almost do it. But they are terrible at ranking. This idea that this is the best grant, this is the next one, and something like that. So when they rank, they bring in all their biases. I don't like this area. I don't like the name. I don't like the paper. I don't like this. I don't like that. I don't like the journal. And those biases then determine rank. And I think that is where the problem exists. Ferric and I, primarily Ferric, we did a study. You want to tell them about the eLife study? The eLife in which there was no difference.
Yeah, we looked at funding decisions that had been made, and we looked at the priority scores given by the study section. And to do this was actually very challenging. We had to be able to get all the anonymized data from the NIH. And it was really, I think, Richard Nakamura who freed up the administrative logjam in making the data available to us. And what we were able to see is that beyond the first percent or so, that whole group of grants, and they all got funded. So they all got money to do their research. And then you could see over time how productive they were depending on the papers generated and the papers that cited those papers. And you look at the productivity and you found that there was no difference between 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, all the way down to the 20th percentile. And so we really had no ability to predict the future. And economists could really tell you that's true. There's an old book from an economist named Malkiel called A Random Walk Down Wall Street. And he pointed out that over time, just randomly throwing your money at the market, like buying a mutual fund and just letting the chips fall, was as good a strategy of trying to pick stocks based on your detailed knowledge of those companies and what was happening. And Warren Buffett said as much. He said he tells his kids to just buy a big fund, you know, with low costs and walk away from it and come back and see how much money they made later. So we're no different in picking grants. We can't predict the future. And sometimes we think we know so much that we end up putting all our money in one area, and the really hot area, which might be mRNA vaccine technology, goes unfunded because of our foolishness in only looking, 2 feet ahead. And so we think that it would be better to introduce a random step and an initial screen to decide which grants are meritorious, and then to have everything randomized. That would get rid of the sex discrimination, the race discrimination, the field discrimination. And then some grants would lose, but they would know that they were meritorious and that they just lost the lottery and they can get back in. And this would also tell politicians, look at all this meritorious research that we're not funding, that we left on the table. We need to have more money for this research. It would give us a direct measure. It would tell your chairman, your grant was just as good as everyone else's. It just lost the lottery this time, but you're worth supporting. I think it would have a lot of advantages. And one by one, people always have the same reaction to Arturo's ideas that I do. The first is that this is crazy. And then you go home and you're like, but he might be right. And I think more and more people are coming around to the idea that this would be the fairest way of allocating funds that would also be good for science, because it would stop our blind spots from interfering with investment in meritorious projects.
Very interesting. So in addition to funding, there are other ways of recognizing great science. I'd love to hear from you. What do you think is the benefit of awards and honors in science? Or let me rephrase that. Are awards and honors in science important?
So what I would say is they're important when they highlight a discovery to the public. That is what I consider importance. I think one should, to me, the great satisfaction of science is internal. But for the Nobel Prize, so we read in a paper, the Nobel Prize is always controversial for a variety of reasons. But in that week, the world focuses on science. And the price that we may all pay by the inequities and all that may be outweighed by the fact that the world notices and can see great science. What do you think?
But there's a dark side to this, I think, because I think that a lot of prizes neglect the way that science is actually done. That a lot of science is done collaboratively by teams. There's a lot of interactiveness, and a lot of people get left out of these prizes. Like when Waxman received his Nobel Prize, that he neglected the fact that Schatz had actually done the work. He didn't even mention him in his Nobel address. And Schatz ended up having to sue him, for royalties for the discovery of this antibiotic. And I think that the way science is actually done today, everything that we do, everything we achieve, is dependent on our community, on things that went on before us, on thousands of other contributions. And it sort of giving prizes distorts a little bit the fact that it's really a community activity. It would be like participating in an Amish barn raising and celebrating the nail that you put in, instead of the fact that as a community you achieve great things. So I think to the extent that it distorts the way science is actually done and the way credit should be given, there's some drawbacks to this. Also, the sociologist Merton described the Matthew effect, named after in the Bible. I'm not a Bible scholar, but it's basically those that have, get more. And awards tend to be like that, that once you're famous and get celebrated, people give you awards so that they can actually give prestige to their award by your having it rather than the other way around. And so I think we should really try to recognize more people more broadly because that can be a real benefit of award. Taking somebody who has done wonderful things that has been relatively unrecognized and bringing attention to them is better than finding some Nobel laureate and giving him yet another prize.
We think the Nobel should be given to fields, not to people. Let's take the CRISPR field. Think about all the people that contributed. Think about only 3 were honored.
Think about the bacteriologists who made the original discovery.
Imagine, though, that you give it to the CRISPR field and celebrate the discovery for humanity, and anybody, whoever had a paper that was relevant to it, can send $15 to Stockholm for a Nobel degree, and you put it in your office. And they collect that money and they use it to support training or something. That would be right. Yeah, we would celebrate it. Everybody gets to be on the party, It sends a message.
Absolutely sends a message. So let's talk about the intersection of science and society. And specifically, I'd love to get your take on how science fared during COVID-19.
I think science achieved a lot of wonderful things during COVID that sadly are not adequately appreciated by the public. I remember during the early days of COVID, how people all over the world were pitching in and sharing what they knew and putting aside their favorite projects to really do anything that they could to help the world to deal with COVID. I think there was a lot of quiet heroism done by scientists at all levels that is not adequately recognized. But I think what happened over time is there was a lot of politicization, and science was actually weaponized. That you started to see things in the literature which were really polemics, which were really extremely flawed work trying to argue that ivermectin was effective when it wasn't, or trying to argue that face masks were detrimental and potentially harmful. And you had scientists fighting with scientists basically for political reasons rather than to try to find out the truth and to do the right thing. And it's understandable that there were these policy differences. But I think one thing that we learned is that when scientists publicly bicker, it turns off the public. And they start to think that scientists are just another special interest group. That when you engage with accusations towards each other, people saying scientists started the pandemic, gain of function research started the pandemic, you have virologists lining up against public health people, the public tends to turn off, and they tend to say there's really no objectivity to science. I think we lost a lot of ground with the public by this kind of thing. I think social media made it possible that as soon as you have an angry thought in your head, you can share it with the world. And not just scientists, but everybody. And I think it's been very harmful. I thought of it kind of like the world was a patient. And when I have a patient where there's a difficult decision to make, we'll have conferences and we'll get together with all the specialists and we'll haggle it out. And people will be very candid. They'll say, if we do that, we might kill the patient. And you can really be honest about your opinion, about your concerns. But at the end of the day, you reach a consensus, and the doctor goes back to the patient's bedside and says, we've talked things over, and we think this might be the best way to go. What do you think? And they negotiate with the patient how they're going to go forward. And I think what happened with COVID is that the Twitter sphere invited the whole world into the room. We were all calling each other names and making accusations, and the public freaked out. They didn't know who to believe. So instead, they asked their neighbor, and they became less trusting of what they heard, less trusting of the media, less trusting of the institutions. And it turns out the countries that did the best with COVID were the ones that had the most trust in their institutions. That even if the government is not always exactly right about what's going on, if you trust that they're doing their best and you can get people to go along with a plan, you can function more as a coordinated society instead of fighting each other. And it was surprising that these really Western advanced scientific societies did so poorly with all of our advantages. And that some of the countries that had no resources at all, but they were able to unify to make a concerted community effort against COVID, they did better than we did. So this was a really sobering lesson to me about the limits of science and how important it is to communicate in a way that is not divisive.
Arturo, I want to give you the last word.
So science worked. Within 1 year, we had vaccines, monoclonal antibodies, small molecule antivirals, rapid tests, and mortality went down tremendously. What we did not anticipate was things like, well, they're putting microchips in it. So but science worked. Can you imagine COVID without science?
It'd be like the medieval plague all over again.
Yeah. Arturo and Ferric, I want to thank you for another profound conversation. As always, I'm struck by your wisdom, humility, and discernment. I appreciate you sharing this with us today.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Ashley.
And thank you for coming.